Forgive me, you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The rabble refuge of your teeming shores, send these, the homeless tempest, tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
We Americans grow up with certain ideas in our heads, like you're innocent until proven guilty. We have freedom of speech and religion, free elections, and on and on. These are part of our federal and state constitutions and our laws. They protect our rights as citizens of the United States. Many countries have similar protections, but there are also countries where a citizen has little or no rights. Their leaders can do any terrible thing they want, and the average person just has to suffer with it. The law of the jungle. So how did we get this system of protections? Well, you could say we fought for it, and we did at various times. But really it evolved bit by bit over more than 1,000 years. Hello, I'm Bill McCune, the writer and producer of Behind the Laws, a history of the creation of the United States and of Arizona, and the content of our two constitutions. Our title comes from a comment made by the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. He said, "Behind the laws, there are stories." In other words, our system of government, our laws, don't just happen out of nowhere. Laws and constitutional provisions are adopted in reaction to historical events. Our purpose here is to capture and share those stories, to offer perspective on the how and the why we became the state and the nation we are. To get a good idea of how this came about, let's look at the history of Great Britain. 2,000 years ago, 54 BC, the Roman leader Julius Caesar invaded southern England. At the time, the place wasn't much organized, mostly a lot of tribal societies scattered about. The Romans hung out for a while, but after 40 years they went home. But a half-century later, they came back and pretty much took over all of Britain, made it in effect part of the Roman Empire for the next 350-odd years. The Roman thing wasn't any kind of modern representative democracy where citizens vote to elect people to run their government, but they did have some impact in introducing a structure of government. So the Romans controlled much of Great Britain, married British girls, and influenced the culture. Well, as things happened around the year 400 AD, the Roman Empire basically fell apart. With them gone, some folks on the European continent said, "Hey, let's go over and pick up where the Romans left off." So around 450 AD, we saw the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, mostly from the place we today call Germany. Some came with armies, others were more like immigrants. Over the years, the Anglo-Saxons spread all over the British Isles, and as usual, intermarried and influenced the culture. And by around the year 800 AD, England had become a big sort of Anglo-Saxon place, but speaking English, not German. This period also saw the first real religious effort in England, as Pope Gregory sent a priest named Augustine to start Christianizing the nation and establishing the church. We mention 800 AD for a reason, for that was about when the British islands came under attack from Scandinavian plunderers called the Vikings. They were pretty mean guys, and maybe that's why the football team these days call themselves the Minnesota Vikings. The original Vikings made brutal raids in England and Ireland, killing huge numbers of people and burning churches and castles. But bad as they were, the Vikings seemed more about looting rather than about setting up governments. Of course, as usual, over the next 100 or more years, some of the Vikings settled there and became part of the landscape. By the year 1000 AD in England, society had become more organized. People were developing trades and commerce. Kings and the nobility class, the upper crust, were ruling larger areas, and significantly, the church had become an organized and powerful structure. But once again, trouble was brewing, this time from over in what we now call France. We've all heard of Normandy, that place on the French coast where in 1944 the Allies hit the beach during World War II. But 1,000 years ago, the people of Normandy were called the Normans, who were actually descendants of the Vikings. The Norman leader was named William, known later as William the Conqueror, a pretty brutal guy sometimes. Long story short, in the year 1066, his army and those of his allies invaded and conquered England yet again. William became the king, gave his supporters royal positions of power, that's the nobility, and in his effort to expand Christianity, pretty much put his own people in the high church positions. As the decades passed under Norman influence, we saw the crown, that means the king, and the feudal nobility become an established, mostly permanent, somewhat bureaucratic, and definitely powerful institution. And the same may be said of the Roman Church as structured in England. As with most of the earlier cases of being conquered, England did not become a French-speaking Norman country. The Normans became English-speaking Englishmen. Just two more quick developments to mention, and they're both about reforms. 100 years after the time of William the Conqueror, there was a king called Henry II. His contribution was to allow the emergence of a body of common law, a more structured legal system to replace the custom of feudal lords enforcing their own rules. The other event was in June of the year 1215, when King John signed the document called the Magna Carta. You see, the nobility, the barons, the dukes, the earls, etc., had come to enjoy a lot of special privileges over the years, but now they had a problem. They felt the king was infringing on their rights, as well as taxing and spending too much money on wars. They invited John to a meeting in the forest to discuss the problem. Actually, it was at sword point that they persuaded him to sign the document agreeing that there are laws protecting the rights of his subjects and communities, and that the king was bound to obey them. It is a cornerstone of the concept of democracy that would ultimately follow. Don't think that the Magna Carta was intended to protect the rights of the average Joe. Not at all. In those days, nobody gave a darn about the well-being of the peasants. The system was called feudalism. It was as if the king owned the entire country. He would give or loan huge areas of land to his friends and gave them fancy titles, barons, dukes, earls, the nobility. Down below them were the little guys who lived on the land and had to do all the work, farming, labor, or fighting in the nobility's little private armies. You really would not want to have been one of these peasants or serfs. It was a pretty crummy job. So the powerful, wealthy nobility in the year 1215 made King John sign the Magna Carta to protect their rights. I emphasize their rights. It said nothing about the rights of the average Joe. Average Joe basically had no rights. But an interesting thing happened. Over the next 300 or 400 years, the average lowly British citizen, including the American colonists, came to believe and insist that the Magna Carta was a statement of their rights as well. Later, as we get into the 1300s and 1400s, England gradually developed some practice of representation that evolved into what today is the British Parliament. So in a broad sense, this brings us up to the point where Christopher Columbus sort of discovers the New World. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all know that rhyme about Columbus discovering America. Did he really? Well, sort of. Actually, he landed in the Caribbean islands off the east coast and to the south. During the next decade, he made the voyage 3 more times and explored around the area. His final visit was in 1502. People tend to picture the history of him discovering what is now the United States. The fact is, he was never within the boundaries of this country. But his most important contribution was popularizing, among Western European countries, the idea of coming to this new world at all. Back in England at about that same time, there was the beginning of a long drama. In 1509, King Henry VII died, and his 17-year-old son became Henry VIII. A few years later, Henry VIII had a wife named Catherine. He was unhappy with her because she could not bear him a son. Then he met a beautiful young woman named Anne Boleyn. He figured the thing to do was divorce Catherine and marry Anne. By that time, the church in Rome, what we now call the Catholic Church, was pretty powerful, and the divorce had to be approved by the Pope at the Vatican. But for various reasons, the Pope refused. Henry was not happy and figured the solution was to take away the Vatican's authority, at least in England. Now, he did not throw the church out altogether. Rather, he just sort of took it over and in a sense made himself the Pope, at least in England. He created what is today called the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, or in America, the Episcopal Church. So if he now ran the country and the church, he could grant himself an annulment of the marriage to Catherine, which he did and married Anne Boleyn. There were many Catholics who didn't buy into this new Church of England business. Henry made brutal rules against them. A Catholic priest could be imprisoned or even executed for not joining up, and this went on for quite a while. A couple of years later, Henry VIII decided to get rid of Anne Boleyn because she, too, could not give him a son. I don't know if he actually divorced her, but he did have her arrested for treason and beheaded. Henry went on to marry 2 more times, but we wonder why a woman would risk that. We tell this story because it started a long and often bloody conflict between Catholics and what became known as Protestants, a history that later influenced the U.S. Constitution. By 30-odd years after the Anne Boleyn incident, Henry had died and his 9-year-old son became King Edward VI. Edward was a sickly boy who died at age 15, just after naming his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant like himself, to take over as queen. Jane was also aged 15. This did not sit well with some in the royal family, including Edward's oldest sister, Mary, who was a Catholic and felt she should be queen. It was not a fancy coronation, but Jane was quickly crowned Queen of England. No sooner had that taken place, but that all hell broke loose. In short, a war between Jane's Protestant supporters and Mary's Catholic supporters. Jane was very bright and well-educated, but still, she was 15 years old. Over the course of a week or so, Mary's forces prevailed and Jane Grey's crown was taken from her. She served as Queen of England a total of 9 days. Mary became Queen Mary I and restored Catholicism as the preferred religion of England. Jane Grey was sent to the royal prison in the Tower of London, and after a short time, on orders from Queen Mary I, was beheaded, having just turned age 16. And some kids today get upset when they can't go to the mall. Queen Mary did, kindly, grant her cousin Lady Jane's last request, that she be beheaded with a sharp sword instead of a blunt axe. After all, she was family. Queen Mary took after her father, Henry VIII, in that she didn't mind having people killed. During her 5.5-year reign, she had about 300 religious dissenters, presumably Protestants, executed. They were not beheaded. They were burned at the stake, thus earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. Mary died in 1558 and was replaced by her younger half-sister, Queen Elizabeth I. Good Queen Bess, as some called her, was the daughter of Henry VIII and his unfortunate second wife, Anne Boleyn, who, you'll recall, Henry had beheaded when baby Elizabeth was only 2 years old. Elizabeth was a Protestant. When older Catholic sister Mary I was queen, Elizabeth was actually sent to prison for supporting Protestant rebels. As queen herself, Elizabeth turned the country back in the Protestant direction. But what's more important about Elizabeth I is that she reigned more than 44 years, brought stability and a national identity to England, and she did this without the brutal approaches of her sister and father. She also nurtured the arts and literature in what is called the Elizabethan era, which produced the likes of William Shakespeare. So if this program is supposed to be about the U.S. and Arizona constitutions, why are we talking about the family feuds of Old English royalty? There are a couple of reasons. One is that our founding fathers, leaders of the Revolution, the drafters of the Constitution, were all basically citizens, subjects of the English crown. This was their history, the history they grew up studying. As such, they knew about the rights an Englishman was entitled to enjoy, topics we'll get to soon. They knew of the good things in English history, and more importantly, they knew of historical things they did not want repeated in the new United States of America. For example, we've been talking here about deadly fights, wars in England over whose religion was going to be the official government policy. There was plenty of that and more to come. But by comparison, look at the very first sentence of the very first amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Quote, "Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." It was as if to say the Founding Fathers knew their history and they'd had enough of that battling over religion business. That was not going to be part of the United States of America. But many other elements of the Constitution as well have their roots in the history and political policies, for better or worse, of the mother country.